From fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada, this is Pod Therapy. Real people, real problems, and real therapists. You can submit your questions anonymously at podtherapy.net or email us at podtherapyguys@gmail.com. Jim has initiated the Pod Therapy Work From Home program this week and will be joining us remotely. Since he won't be in the studio to see my usual looks of disappointment, I'll just have to text him emojis. Frowny face emoji, send. And now, broadcasting from the churn, that guy is Dr. Jim Jobin. I'm Nick Tangeman. It's time for some Pod Therapy.
Live from quarantine, it's Pod Therapy. Yeah. So if you're not a Patreon of the show, I am broadcasting from my house because best practices right now is if you have somebody in your household who is sick, you should stay home. And so out of an abundance of caution to protect Jacob and Nick, I am staying home.
I was thinking about
this.
The
magic of technology, we're able to talk.
I was thinking about this too. It's probably a good thing that you're doing this because it's not just protecting Jacob and I, but we share the studio. Obviously, this isn't our studio. So right. Matt, Paul, and their families as well. So I'm glad to not see you today. Now, to paint a picture of what this looks like for us in the studio, we basically just have my phone. Jim is calling in on my phone. He's recording his own audio at home. Yep. So hopefully in post we can fix it, make it sound like a real podcast. But for us right now, we basically just have a phone up to a microphone, and then we've got the earphones on the phone so Jim can hear us. So it's
and then I'm at home with my own microphone into my own system. So whenever you're listening to this in the real world, my microphone will sound different than Jacob's and Nick's, and that's just because I'm not using one of Jacob's amazing microphones. And I'm at home, and so there's a little bit of ambient noise. But I know you guys forgive us as we try to do the right thing and try to just get through this whole new Corona era together, because the world is changing, isn't it, Nick?
It definitely is. And in the Patreon part of the show, Jim kind of let us know a little bit about what's going on over there. Some family members are sick, so quarantine, so just going to play it safe.
Scabies,
yes. Yeah. He denies that. We have our own theories about what's going on. I think this has to do with the Poly Mustang thing.
And I think it's because Jim doesn't want us to sneak new bumper stickers onto his car while he's here.
Yeah.
That's essentially, I'm sticking to my story of I'm a hero, and what I've done is honorable and kind. And let's go with that.
Of course, you're the hero of your own story.
Well, the world is changing, and so this is actually what's going to lead us into kind of our A block today, friends. And the thing that we wanted to talk about, Nick and I are still practicing. Nick's still continuing to do his duties with monitoring mental health care and substance abuse care in Nevada, and I'm still seeing patients. And the people that I'm seeing, I'm definitely watching as I'm experiencing them during different phases of this crisis. And again, I'm mostly working with local Nevadans, and Nevada is one of those first states to sort of be completely shut down, where at this point all of our businesses are told to close except for essential ones, and people are pretty much told just to stay home, and schools are canceled and all that stuff. So we're experiencing a lot of levels to this. I think that there's like a level of, hey, we're just scared of a virus and we're scared of this hurting people. I think there's a level of economic anxiety of, hey, businesses are closing and the money is kind of tight. What's going to happen? And then I think there's a third level, which is, hey, how long is this going to last? And like, what does life look like once there's been this amount of disturbance globally, economically, in healthcare? If we don't just have a cure that comes out and and this was one report I was reading, Nick was talking about how it could be the case, and we don't know. But down the road, it may be a thing where they sort of every once in a while, a state or a city just has to go down to lockdown again for 6 weeks to just sort of reboot, the immunity and make sure that, the virus is stopped again. And that might go on, for maybe 18 months, 2 years or something like that, where periodically cities are just told to shut down again because their viral cases have gotten a little too high. So we're hearing that the world is shifting really quickly.
I agree. And I was going to say, I just my own personal experience, looking at how this has changed my thought process about this virus is really astounding. And I think it's kind of interesting too, because of how late our show comes out. I mean, the news cycle pretty much ends on Friday. We record on Sunday, and it's Thursday before our show actually gets out to everybody. So we're a week behind. So by the time I actually listen to the show, my mind has been changed a lot from the time we record it to the time it comes out. And in the very beginning, I was one of the people that was kind of like, this is going to blow over. This isn't going to be that big of a deal. But now I'm really kind of towards the camp of like, this is probably going to be a long-term thing. And we may not be on lockdown for very long, hopefully not, but it's going to be a slow, gradual recovery. I'm kind of starting to mentally prepare myself for that.
Well, what you just said, there's a worldview shift that people are going through. And that's what I wanted to talk about to the general audience, because as you're turning on the internet and as you're reading the headlines, and again, our show comes out after those headlines, right? So we don't know what the latest news is, but I promise that latest news is talking about forecasts, and it's talking about here's the course of this disease and what we think is going to happen. Here's how many people might get it, and here what the results might be. You're hearing news like here's what the economies are going to look like, or here's what's going to happen. And that kind of stuff, I think the more you're digesting that and the more you're seeing it, it causes anxiety, for sure. It causes depression, for sure. And I think your entire worldview shifts, kind of like what Nick was talking about. One minute you're like, oh, this is a nothing burger. And the next minute you're like, hey, this might be the defining event of my lifetime. And this may be the thing that ultimately changes what normal gets to look like, maybe in the short term, maybe even in the medium term, in the span of years. And to some extent, there will be down the road repercussions perhaps for years. And it could be something that redefines culture and redefines the world. And that was kind of the thing that I wanted to talk about in the A block. You see, you've heard Nick and I talk about this before, but we have this model that we use to describe whenever humans encounter drastic change. And when humans encounter drastic change, and by drastic change I don't mean like they lose their favorite shoes. I mean like a worldview shift. Like somebody in their life has died, or they had a job for 20 years and they've been let go of it, or they have to move and they've lost their home, or they have to move to another state, or you were living in a time of peace and now it's a time of war. Whenever there's a drastic change, humans go through this process that we call grieving. And a lot of people misunderstand that word grieving, and they think it just means sadness. But for us, for Nick and I, and for therapists, we see grief as a process. It's a digestive process, a series of perspectives and reactions as humans try to sort of metabolize changes that are happening. And it's a predictable sort of step-by-step theory of how humans typically go through that process. So what we were thinking we would do here in the A block is bring you, I think, good news. And that's the thing I want you guys to hold on to. There's good news in all this, and know that news is not going to be, here's the prediction about how the disease is going to work, and know that that news is not going to be, here's my predictions about the economy. That news is coming from a therapist saying, here's my predictions about you, and here's my predictions about society. Here's what is likely to happen or is already happening, and here's where that eventually turns into. Here's what's eventually going to happen. So you've heard us talk before about the 7 stages of grief, and there's different models. There's a shorter one, which is sort of the 5 stages of grief. Today I want to unpack the 7 stages of grief, because I think that 7-stage model kind of applies to what we're talking to, and I think it's like a really good, example. Because the stages of grief actually apply to the way people are sort of seeing the corona crisis. And I think for a lot of us, we can relate to some of these stages, and maybe some of these stages are still ahead. But by talking about it with you right now, if those future stages happen, you'll be able to come back to this recording and say, okay, this is predictable. What I'm experiencing is normal. The world is not what I think it is. And if I'm experiencing this stage, maybe stage 4, that means that there's going to be a stage 5, 6, and 7, and that there's eventually going to be change. So I wanted to take a second and unpack that. So we're talking about the 7 stages of grief, and we're talking about how it applies to the coronavirus situation. So let me start with the first stage. The very first stage of grief that we think about is usually shock and denial. And so when something big and drastic happens, when there's a declaration of war, when somebody dies in your life, whenever you've lost your job, or in this case, all of the above because of coronavirus. It threatens your safety, it threatens your economy, it threatens your regular way of life, it changes your ability to see family and friends, it changes what you think about the future. And when this thing first rolls out, the first stage of grief that humans generally go through, and I think this is happening on a society-wide scale, is shock and denial. And so in that stage, that's whenever we're sort of minimizing it. We're saying, no, this can't be what it seems to be. It can't be as big as it appears to be. It can't be the scarier things that people are saying. Or we're reacting with just speechlessness and going, wow, this is happening so fast. I don't have an emotional reaction. I'm just stunned and I'm staring at it the way you might stare at an explosion or a car accident, and you're just sort of paralyzed. And I think society has gone through that stage, or is going through that stage, maybe even right now, where there's sort of this breathless staring at how big this is, and you're watching as segments of the society stop being in denial about how serious this thing is, and seem to start landing in this place of saying, wow, this is for real, and just sort of being taken aback by it. So I think that's the first stage, and Nick, you were saying earlier that you kind of relate to that.
So, yeah, I mean, that I definitely experienced. I think with the stages too, like it's not always going to be chronological. You kind of go back and forth. And I feel like I continue to bounce back to this one every once in a while. But also, I think part of that is because overall, my demeanor is optimistic. I'm a very optimistic person. So when something happens, something drastic happens, I'm usually the first to say, okay, this it always is going to appear very shocking at first, but we're fine. We're going to get through this. It's probably not going to be that big of a deal. We'll survive. That's just kind of my default position, I think. But there are times when I think, when I do have that shock, that initial, like, kind of, oh shit moment, I guess. And I think for me with this, it was, God, there was that one, I'm trying to remember exactly when it was. I think it was when Governor Sisolak, the governor of Nevada, came on and, talked about, shutting down non-essential businesses. I think that was the moment for me that I was like, oh, wow. Okay.
Right.
Like this is pretty serious.
Yeah.
If that's happening.
Yeah. And I think that's how most people are interpreting this. So the first stage of grief that most of us go through is what Nick just described. There's a shock. There's sort of this disbelief. That's the denial part. A disbelief or a minimizing of it and saying, oh, I'm sure this will blow over. Oh, I'm sure it's not that scary. Or just your brain can't yet digest the magnitude of what's happening. And that leads to the second stage. And so the second stage of grief is what we call pain and guilt. And that can be a lot of things. It can be pain, it can be sadness, it can be fear. But it's this sense of like suffering. And so you're starting to just crash into this wave of loss. And that's the second thing is a lot of people experience this fear and this anguish. And that's that second stage where you start to look around and you say, oh no, what are we going to do? And that's that fear of looking around at your society and saying, wait, this business just shut down. Oh no, these people are being laid off. Oh no, the hospitals don't have enough masks. Oh no, look at the red maps that are showing the infections. And oh no, look at the counts. And that's that second stage. That first stage is not fully seeing it and being minimalist about it or just being shocked by it. And that second stage is being overwhelmed by it and looking at the magnitude of the problem. And feeling this pain and this fear from all sides, a fear internally of your own livelihood, a fear of the entire world being okay, a sense of anxiety and a sense of panic and a sense of pain. And so that second stage is whenever you're just excruciating, you feel overwhelmed, you don't know what to do about it. And it's not necessarily sadness, it's just fear. And it's the sense of anguish. And you're just looking in every direction and you're just feeling affected by this. And, Nick, what you were saying a second ago is once the governor sort of announced, hey, listen, I'm taking this fully seriously. I'm literally going to shut down an entire state to protect this. It sounds like that's whenever you switched out of shock and denial. Did you find yourself experiencing a stage where it was like, oh, wow, I'm kind of frightened by this now, to the extent, for you, compared to your own baseline of general optimism, there must have been the shift into that second stage of saying, wow, this is this is scary now, and I'm feeling some pain and some fear about this.
A little bit, but minimally. There was never a sense. I still don't, at this point, have kind of a sense of dread.
Right.
It is affecting me a lot closer now. It's hitting a lot closer to home. I mean, immediately, like, my family is pretty safe. There's going to be some negative effects, but myself, my girlfriend, we're going to be okay. Our jobs are probably pretty stable. I don't think I'm as confident this week as I was last week with my position. Just because it's
right.
nothing's certain, nothing's for sure. I don't see any reason why my job would be eliminated or laid off temporarily. But it could happen. I don't know. It could happen. But I think, around me, I'm seeing the effects. I see a lot of friends whose jobs are being affected. My sister, her job's now affected. Like, she is working from home, but a big part of her job was traveling. Like, she was on the road, to at least once a week, spending 3 or 4 days in a different city every single week, and now she's grounded. So she's doing some work from home,
right.
but it's not the same thing that she was doing before. And my mom is a retired teacher, so she was doing some substitute work, but that's now stopped. My
right.
dad's job's been affected a little bit, and it's probably going to be affected even more in the future. So, like, my immediate circle around me, I'm seeing the effects. I'm not feeling it directly myself, but it is like it's got my attention. It's I kind of feel like a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs.
Right.
Just kind of
right.
being alert, like everything that's around me now, that it's getting a little closer.
Right. Well, a lot of the patients that I'm dealing with, especially local Nevadans, and this is, again, not a local Nevada thing, it's a global thing. But for many listeners, as you're hearing this, you may have gone through a phase where you didn't think that any of this was real, and that was your denial phase. And now you might be experiencing those first bad consequences of industries closing down, layoffs, shutdowns, quarantines, disruption. And you may be crashing into anguish and fear and a sense of pain. And when you're going through that sense of anguish and uncertainty and pain, that's that second stage. And like Nick was sharing, he's a little bit more insulated than some other folks, but we could name every industry that's being disrupted by this, every regular human being, and the way they draw a paycheck and the way that they live their lives is being rattled by this. And so that second stage in this process of great change, which we call the stages of grief, is pain, anguish, fear. It's the experiencing of the thing in a painful way. And this leads to the third stage. And a lot of you guys have heard us talk about this before. But the third stage is sort of a combination of anger and bargaining. And this is when people just get mad. They're made to feel scared and hurt in the second stage. And now in the third stage, they're angry about it, and they're reacting to it, and they're lashing out about it. And you're seeing society sort of do this. Now there's these great debates about, like, hey, how is the government going to respond to this? And why aren't the hospitals doing more? And why aren't there tests? And why isn't the government stepping up? And why is this so late? And why don't we have more information? And then there's anger at your local state governments and city governments. Why are you telling us we have to close our doors? And then this anger at grocery stores. Why don't you guys have more supplies? And then there's just this frustration and this desire to sort of figure it out. And that's that bargaining piece. How can I exact control over the world around me? What can I do? And that's whenever we're going through this process of, like, using ourselves and our thoughts to speak out and get angry and try to participate. And that can be online. That could be, writing to your politicians. That could just be screaming into the dark. For many people, that in their anger and their bargaining stage, they're stocking up on supplies. They're trying to in some way control what they're feeling and that fear and that anguish. And it's turning into rage sometimes. It's turning into this just white hot rage that the world is broken, that it doesn't look like it's supposed to look, that we're losing things that we're supposed to have. And so that third stage of anger and rage, I don't personally relate to that yet. I don't think Nick would relate to that either, but I think a lot of people are starting to enter that. They went through their denial, they went through their shock, they went through some pain and some fear and some anguish in the short term of this. Now they're starting to get furious and they're starting to get angry. Why are we being locked into our houses? Why are you telling us what to do? Why can't we just keep the economy going? Or why are the hospitals not bigger? And so now there's a lot of anger and a lot of frustration, which, Nick, you and I have seen that in other people when they're going through their grieving process, that at some point they land on like an anger phase. And sometimes they don't even know who to direct that anger at. They just feel powerless. And it's kind of it erupts out of their fear in a sense.
Yeah, I'm not experiencing that. But I as we're going through this, I'm wondering what stage what's the doctor's name? Dr. Fauci or whatever. That's the doctor.
I think you're thinking of Dr. Phil.
No. Yeah. Yeah. The epidemiologist or whatever. I don't know if he's an epidemiologist, but the doctor that's always behind.
Yeah, the CDC director.
Behind Trump. Like, as we're going through these, I'm like, yeah, I could see him in that phase too right now. I can see him going through that.
Right.
I've skipped all the other phases. I'm just living at being pissed. I'm just hanging out at just being pissed off.
Is that just your norm?
I mean, usually
that's the status quo.
Yeah. Just redirecting.
It's like that scene in the Avengers when they ask Bruce Banner how he doesn't get angry and become the Hulk, and he says, "I'm just always angry."
Right. Yep.
Yeah, that's pretty much me right now. I'm just.
But no, there's some truth to that.
I really am just constantly pissed right now.
You're now just in that phase of just dealing with it and just being angry at the whole thing.
Are you identifying people that you're angry with, or situations, or is it just kind of a general?
Oh no. There are people that I'm angry at. They're I'm angry with my mortgage company. I'm angry with I'm angry with the local state government, not the local government so much, but the state government. I guess I am a little aggravated with the local government too. I'm aggravated with how the Las Vegas mayor is handling things. I'm just generally aggravated and pissed about all of it.
Yeah.
I think it's going to happen on a society-wide scale too, and I think it also happens in individual lives. After you've been made to feel afraid and you're hurting, you enter into this anger stage. And yeah, you start it's not that you're looking for people to blame, it's that you're honestly metabolizing the energy. And you're looking at everybody that has power, the mayor, the governor, the bosses, the investor class, the hospital people, whoever, and you're saying, why aren't you doing more? What's happening? And sometimes there is this desire to control it. That's what we call the bargaining part. But that anger part is for real. And my thought and concern about that on a social level is that as a society, that's the kind of thing that can sometimes lead to riots, can sometimes lead to protests, can sometimes lead to people acting out, because they're in that state of rage and anger and feeling desperate. Sometimes in stage 3, that's when those kinds of things start to rumble beneath the surface. But if we continue, if we persist through stage 3 and we accept that this is part of the process of how humans metabolize change, we land in stage 4. Stage 4 is what we call the depression stage. It's depression, it's reflection, it's loneliness. It's a stage where you just feel you're talked out of it. You can't process this anymore. And you're starting to just stare at the world. And you're starting to feel like you've lost everything. You've lost whatever normal was for you. Whatever you imagined that your life was going to look like. Whatever you imagined that your normal was going to look like. You start to feel so disconnected from that you start to feel hopeless. And you start to feel overwhelmed. Now, that depression stage is a very powerful one, guys, and it's the one most people associate with grieving, because when they think of loss, whether that's a loved one or a job or a house or anything, you think of sadness. But again, what we're telling you today is that there's these stages, and again, Nick's right, they don't always go in a straight line, but they generally happen as phases, and whenever you get to the 4th one and you enter that funk, that depression, that sadness, that lowness, that is a really hard space to be. Because that's whenever you enter into this place of not believing that it could ever get better again, believing that it's pointless. You land in this place of why try, and you start to believe the whole world is as dark as you feel. That you can't just be angry at people anymore because it's hopeless. They're just not going to fix anything. There is no way out of this. normal is gone forever, and you land in this place of feeling such a sense of loss and such a sense of mourning. And guys, the reason why we're rolling out this idea of the stages of change, or I'm sorry, the stages of grief, is because in this situation, one thing you may realize as time continues is that it is very possible that this global pandemic does cause the end of one world and the beginning of another world. And I'm not talking about an apocalypse, and I'm not talking about Armageddon, but I am talking about a way that modern life once worked, the way you as a human thought about your own personal success, what happiness looked like, what your personal goals were, and what you imagined for the future, for yourself, for the world, for all of it. And this could be more than a disruption. It could become a transition. The end of one era and the beginning of another for a while. And, eventually we hope that the world can change back, but because there is a loss of normality, you might go through these stages of grief, and that will eventually include a sense of depression. But the thing you have to remember, if you land in that place, if you feel emptiness and despair, you have to hold on to this truth. That is one of the stages, and it will eventually pass. And that the world is going to exist, and the new normal is going to take place. And yes, there's a sense of loss, but there's also a sense of opportunity. And Nick, I don't know what you've noticed, and Jacob, I don't know what you've seen in your friends and your colleagues. In some of my patients, I am seeing some of them begin to enter into that mentality of looking around and saying, wait a minute, people are talking about this lasting for years now. If there's that much of a disruption, oh my goodness, maybe this is the kind of thing that it is going to change my life, and this will be a lifetime change, and there's a sense of loss and sadness and despair. Are either of you guys beginning to see people go through that? And if not, I don't expect that this early we would see it, because I think on a social level we're not there yet. But do either of you guys notice that happening?
Well, I think the pertinent issue, I think, with this particular stage of change, when we're talking about depression, is one of the big things that is a protective factor for depression is human contact. And the fact that you've got this now mixed in with a quarantine, which limits human contact, it makes it, you're basically losing a protective factor that you would otherwise have, which I think is going to be an issue in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about it on the Patreon. I have SJ and I have two friends that we've just been exposed. The four of us have been exposed to each other the whole time, and so they come to our house, we go to their house. We've been doing it probably it's been a week since we recorded last. We've probably been with them 3 of the nights in this last week, and that looks like it's just going to be our normal for as long as this lasts. Just every other day or so, we'll just hang out either at their place or our place. We take the dogs. We both have dogs, and so the dogs play together. We hang out in the pool or in the hot tub or just sit around and have drinks. And that staves off a lot of that.
Yeah. And I think what you're both describing there is something I want the listeners to understand. If you land into that stage of grief we call depression, reflection, loneliness, what Nick and Jacob are teaching you is that perspective is so important, because depression, as you know from listening to our show regularly, is a perspective. Depression is a delusion. It is a false interpretation of the world. And if you're not careful, you can believe that lie, that the world is hopeless, that your life is going nowhere, that only bad things are ahead. And this becomes part of the problem with the news cycle. As important as I think the news is, and as much as I believe journalists are trying their best to give us information, we as human beings have to respect our own limits and respect our own emotional and psychological limits. And one of the things I want you, the listener, to understand is that sometimes it's not about what's true and false. Sometimes the most important thing to you is not what's true or what's false. Sometimes what is really important to you is what's helpful and what's unhelpful. And there's going to be times throughout this crisis era where you're going to have to reflect and realize, right now the news is not helpful. Me hearing about this information, hearing how dire it is, hearing how other governments are struggling, hearing how there's bad things happening, does not better equip me to do what I need to do today, does not better equip me to survive, does not better equip me to succeed. And so as you're entering that depression state, if you do, it's very important that you begin to root out perspectives and voices that you're listening to and that you're consuming, which are influencing that dire worldview. And it's very important, as Nick said, as Jacob said, that you start to cultivate voices and perspectives that remind you it's gonna be okay, that we're gonna get through this. You need that fresh perspective. It's fresh air. And if you get through the depression stage, if you get through stage 4 of the stages of grief, you enter into what we call stage 5, the upward turn. And so the upward turn is this sense of small adjustment. We start to feel a little bit calmer. We start to feel a little bit more organized in our personal life and in the way the world's going to work around us. We start to feel a little bit physically better. The depression starts to lift a little bit, and we start to have this sense, it's a very small one, but a sense of maybe optimism. And what's interesting about stage 5, the upward turn, is that isn't dependent on society. That isn't dependent on the news. That isn't dependent on how we're doing with this virus or what's happening next. Because as you're progressing through the stages of grief, when you hit the upward turn, you're just starting to grow through that depression, and you're starting to see just the beginning of hope again, just the beginning of accepting that, okay, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how the world crisis is going to land. I don't know which governments are going to do what and how we're all going to get through this. But I know for me, I'm going to do the next right thing, and I'm going to focus on what I can control, and I'm going to take those steps forward, and I'm feeling more and more emotionally at peace with the situation, and we're not feeling as hopeless, and we're not feeling as dire. We're starting to feel, again, it's more of a feeling than an action. We're starting to feel like the world's going to maybe get through this at some point. Now, again, looking at the way grief works, if you think about grief like you've lost somebody that you love, well, the upward turn, stage 5, is not believing that grandpa's going to come back. That's not the belief that you have. But you start to have this sense of, it's going to be okay, I'm going to be okay. Even if you don't know how, even if you don't know what that looks like yet. It's the beginning of the break in the clouds and the beginning of that sunlight coming through. The upward turn is whenever you start to emotionally and physically feel like maybe we're going to find a way through this.
Could even be the coming to peace. It could even be the coming to peace with a new normal.
Yes. It's a sense of acceptance. They're in AA, they talk about the prayer of serenity. And serenity, the prayer is a script, and it says, please grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the knowledge to know the difference, or the wisdom to know the difference. And in this case, the upward turn is acceptance. And not full acceptance, but the beginning of this idea of serenity, the beginning of feeling like maybe we're going to start to feel like we get through this. And again, that's not to say that the depression's gone all at once. It starts to chip away. And that is what opens the door to stage 6. And stage 6 in the stages of grief is reconstruction and working through. We as individuals start to become more functional. We start to do things. Our hands move, our feet move, our mind starts working again. It doesn't feel paralyzed by hopelessness and sadness and this fear that nothing will ever be the same again. We start to almost look around and size up realistic solutions to real problems that we're dealing with. We start to say, okay, I have this specific problem in front of me. I guess this is what I can do right now to deal with that. I'm thinking about what comes next right now. I'm starting to focus on how I can get organized and how I can be functional. We start to look at finances. We start to look at our friendships. We start to look at our families. We start to look at the things that we have control over. And in that phase, in that stage 6, we start trying to reconstruct. And on a social level, when we look at this societally, I think that we're going to see that happen at some point. Again, there is going to be a social level of just shock and denial. I think that we are starting to come out of that. I think there is a stage of just pain and anguish and loss, and I think that's what's happening now. I think it's going to turn into a social reaction of anger and frustration and rage at the powers and the situations that we're facing. I think it will eventually morph into a sense of hopelessness, a sense of depression. On the social level, a sense of loss that will never be better, that this is now now forever or the end of all things. And then eventually it will morph into the beginning of the upward turn, that small song of optimism and hope, and that will give way to reconstruction and working through, the belief that we can start to function at some level, that there are things I can be realistic about, put my hands on, and try to control. And if we are successful at that, we finally land on the 7th stage. And this is the one you've probably heard about before. It's acceptance and hope. Now, don't misunderstand. Stage 7, acceptance and hope, does not mean you've rebuilt normal. It doesn't mean you rebuilt the world. It doesn't mean you resurrected Grandpa and now you have him back again. It doesn't mean you got your job back and everything's fine. It doesn't mean you bought a new house and everything's fine again. It doesn't mean that anything's fixed. It doesn't even mean that we have a vaccine or a cure for this virus. It means that internally, psychologically, emotionally, you've landed at a place where you have now accepted this huge change in your life. And that change can be a variety of changes, but now you've come to a place where you're accepting that this is your new normal, and that doesn't necessarily ruin you. Yeah, there's a lot of things that you've lost, but now you've accepted that loss, you've digested that loss, and now you're feeling actually a small sense of hope, a sense of hope for what is possible. You start to look around at the world that's left, the normal that's available, and now you start to feel a sense of hope inside of that new paradigm. Again, it's a life without Grandpa. It's a life without that job. It's a life without that house. It's a life in this new context of how we as a society function. It's a life without your normal distractions, your sports, your travel, the retirement that you were planning on. It's a new life. But you reach a place of acceptance and hope surrounding that life. And whenever that happens, that's whenever we say that the stages of grief have been processed, grieving has been achieved, and the human being is now reaching health and is now able to move forwardly in their life again.
I assume that when you say acceptance, reaching acceptance and everything, you are referring to the Las Vegas strip club Little Darlings, who is now offering drive-through stripper services.
Yeah, that's the best example of the 7 stages of
I think
grief.
so.
I think if you're looking for just like a concrete example, that's the one.
All right, well, what are we doing here?
Well, I'm under quarantine, but you guys have fun.
No, you stay in the car.
But to all the listeners out there who are going through this, the thing that I want you to take away from us talking about the stages of grief, it's to help you understand that the things that you're experiencing now and the things you may experience next, that is part of a process of you understanding change that's happening in your life that you don't have direct control over. And I need you to get through that, to get through the anger, to get through the depression, because there is an upward lift, there is reconstruction, there is acceptance and hope. And no matter how bad this looks, no matter how scary this looks, there is a world on the other side of this crisis. And you and I are going to figure it out together. We're going to rebuild it together. And we are going to go on and achieve a new sense of normal, whatever that looks like.
Okay. Anything else to add to that?
No. I just want people to remember this is a process. It's going to get better. Even if society gets worse, you're going to be okay.
Right on. And write in. Let us know how things are going. It'd be great to hear from everybody and just if there's anything we can help with.
Yeah, and on that note, before we break for the commercial, something that I'm going to be offering, and the Patreon crowd is going to hear about it, I'm going to be opening up Zoom support groups where we can get folks into a chat room. You don't even have to use video. You can just use a phone. But I want to give people the chance to just kind of be together. As Nick said, as Jacob said, we need that perspective. We need support. We need to just be together. And so I'm going to be bringing that out here in the next week. So if you're not a Patreon member, as low as $1, you can support this show. You can support what we're trying to do. We're trying to be a force for mental health, especially during this crisis era. If that's something you think is important and you want to participate in, please get onto the Patreon. If for some reason you can't afford that $1, just email us and we'll make sure that we keep you in the list so that way you're seeing the resources that we're putting out too.
Yep. All right, well, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be discussing identifying relationship problems. You're listening to Pod Therapy.
This week's THERAPRODUCER sponsor is Robert Browning Jr. Mint. Former board chairman Mint is known for his 15-month record of highest supporter of the show and his early encouragement of pod therapy innovations like Book Club and Jim's Apologies. However, Robert is best known as the lesser half of Pod Therapy's power couple along with Kate Keller. who is also a long-term supporter of the show, creator of the Pod Therapy comic, fan art, the pterodactyl icon for the Patreons, and the infamous Jim's Vasectomy comic, which has sadly been saved in the archives of the internet forever. Under Junior Mint's chairmanship, the THERAPAL community enjoyed an era of peace through party unity with only minimal imprisoning of dissidents, a necessary sacrifice for the glory of our great people. If you'd like to join Robert Brownie Jr. Mint and make the show possible, you can go to www.patreon.com/therapy and sign up. Again, that's patreon.com/therapy.
We're back. You're listening to Pod Therapy. Our next question is about identifying relationship problems.
Hi guys! Firstly, I want to personally thank you two for giving so much insightful information on your podcast to many listeners like myself. I've personally searched for help after listening. My name is Sydney, and I have a problem with my romantic relationship. I'd like to lay it out as simple as I can. I've known my girlfriend for about 10 years now, dating for 7, and it isn't an understatement to say that we are deeply in love with each other. We have fought very hard against ourselves to become better for each other, as I have made many regrettable mistakes that hurt her, as well as she to me. Another person in her life is also my high school best friend, whom I've known for as long as I've known her. We were all good friends with each other. Problems began emerging when I started to date my girlfriend, as he, I guess that's the friend, avoided the two of us. At this time, I didn't know they both had feelings for each other. This caused a lot of strain in our relationship, but eventually we were beginning to come to terms. I allowed her to see him as a friend, stating, "Please let me know if you were to see him," and she did. But every time she was with him, he would say things to her, like confessing his love, and hoping he can be with her, and wishing that she would leave me, etc. I was confident this wasn't a problem because she spoke to me openly about these conversations, and had said that she only viewed him as a friend and didn't want these interactions anymore. Then he said to her that he would have to stop communicating with her because he was pursuing another love interest, and I quote, "He can't keep waiting for her." He gave her the ultimatum, either you come with me or I can't talk to you anymore. She is conflicted because he gave her this choice, him or me. She confessed to me that I wasn't her first choice, but nevertheless said that she wanted to stay with me. She told me that she's embarrassed, ashamed, and conflicted that I wasn't her first choice. She asked me for time to evaluate the emotions that she's going through, and I complied. I'm still waiting for her response. So here's the problem. At first, I didn't want to believe it, but I'm convinced. Is this sort of thing emotional manipulation? I've always trusted both of them, and my friend was always respectful toward her, always pulling away when she didn't want to have those conversations. They do have feelings toward each other, though. Am I in the wrong? Either way, I'll be searching for a relationship counselor no matter what the outcome. I just like a professional opinion on where I might start. I'm willing to provide more information if needed. Thanks, guys. Sydney.
Wow.
Sheesh.
Yeah, that sucks.
Jeez.
Yeah, I have a tremendous amount of empathy for you being in this situation, because that's not an easy situation to be in, and you're kind of just put on hold. It's really not fair to you that you just have to sit and wait for somebody to make a decision. That's a terrible position to be in. And I guess I got so many questions, like, you're not her first choice, but she's wanting to stay with you anyway. Yeah. Jacob is motioning run, and that might not be a bad idea.
Run, don't walk.
I don't know. I mean, Jim, what do you think? Is there any reason you would stay in this relationship? I mean...
Yeah, that's a good question. And to the writer, I think the thing that I kind of picked up in here is they do seem kind of youngish. They had, close friend from high school. The three of them were all friends. This person has known the girlfriend for 10 years, but they've been together for 7. And so I would probably guess that they're somewhere in their early 20s, somewhere in that range. The writer didn't say it. And why I think that's relevant is because, writer, this is probably like your first for real relationship. And whenever you're in a relationship that kind of extends from high school and extends from your childhood, there is this sense that that person is everything, and that they are the one, or that you need to gauge your own value based on how they perceive you. But what's tricky about that is because they're your high school sweetheart, they start to grow over time too. And part of growing up is that you want to have new experiences, you want to have diversity, and you do start to kind of wonder what life is like elsewhere and what other relationships are like. So I'm just resonating with the writer that I think this is complicated, and I can understand why the writer is looking at this and saying, well, I don't want to just throw this away, but at the same time, when the writer describes this as emotional manipulation, it is emotional manipulation, but I think it's also a statement, right? The best friend is saying, listen, I'm tired of waiting for this. I'm going to tell you I'm available now, or I'm closing the door. And that ultimatum is causing the girlfriend to sort of feel like she needs to make a decision. I don't know, Nick, and I'll be interested in your thoughts on this. I don't know that the writer could have handled this a whole lot differently.
No, I don't think so either.
I mean, you and I talk about this all the time. We don't think you can play relationship defense. I don't think that the writer should have said you're not allowed to talk to best friend anymore, or, whatever. I think the writer maybe could have confronted best friend and said, hey, I'm really uncomfortable with this and I'm going to draw a boundary. But what do you guys think? Is there a way that he should have handled this differently to prevent this outcome?
I don't know as if there's a way that I don't think you could prevent it. Yeah, because this is what it is, and
it sounds like it was coming.
Exactly. I don't think you could have prevented it in any way, shape, or form. I think the most important thing is what you do now. And I guess, if you wanted to stay in this relationship, fine, that's up to you. That's your call. I'm never going to tell anybody that they need to get out unless there's like domestic violence or something really unhealthy like that. But I do think, I guess my big concern is I would want you to evaluate what is your motivation for staying in the relationship. And is it based off of something that you value in this person, or is it based off of fear? Because if this is the case, like Jim said, where it's kind of a high school sweetheart type thing, and if this is kind of your first love, sometimes people get into those situations and feel like, I need to make this work. She's 1 in a million, and there's never going to be another person like her. And I always caution people about that, just because there's a lot of human beings out there, and the fact that you just happen to meet the perfect one right out of high school, and she's not even sure if she wants to be with you, and you're not her first choice. There's a lot of women out there. I think you could don't stay into this situation because you feel like you can't do better.
My life coach advice,
yes,
would be to bail, would be to get out in such a way that it's just, great. Go. You need to. It sounds like you need to go figure out who your first choice is, and let's take some time and figure that out. And we got all the time in the world. It's we don't have to decide this today. This can be we can decide this over a period of time. It can be an indefined period of time. Go do your thing. Figure it out. If we get back together, we get back together. I'm not going to be sitting around waiting on you. So if you do decide to come back, that might not be an option. Like you might want to come back, and there might not be anything to come back to. But I would. This seems like a tainted thing at this point, based on, admittedly, a single email being all the information that I have.
But I think that's great advice, because what that does is that really highlights that this is her thing. This isn't the writer's issue. This is her issue that she's dealing with, and if she needs time to figure that out, then give her that time to figure it out.
It's hard for us to look at someone else's issue and be like, hey, I can't do anything about this. Yeah. I can't help you with this. You got to go take the time to figure this out. Because if you hold on to it right now and you continue the relationship right now, that just seems like a bad spot for that. Like that seems like you're dooming the relationship, honestly, to me. Again, based on a single email. But it sounds like that. Like that. I would be afraid that would just completely take any future away from the possibility of this relationship being a strong and healthy relationship going forward.
I agree. I think I totally agree. I think that would probably send kind of a message of I don't know the right way to put it, but like weakness in a sense that
it's very simply, I've never talked to a couple who were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. Be like, oh, what was the story of your engagement? And that story never starts with, well, there was an ultimatum.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true.
Yeah, ultimatums do not make good love songs. No. I agree with Jacob. I think that he's on the right track. And, the only thing I would add to Jacob's point to the writer is I think that there's an adult way, and it sounds like you and your girlfriend have a very good, transparent relationship. Yep. She's kind of told you all along everything that gets said, and she's telling you right now, hey, I'm being honest about my feelings, and look at me telling you the truth, and hey, bravo. That's extremely mature. But I still think Jacob's right that you're allowed to draw a boundary, Ryder, and you're allowed to say, hey, girlfriend, I appreciate you telling me this. I'm a little bit confused. Sure. I have a little bit of resentment, a little bit of anger. Okay. I'm trying not to act on that. But I do think it's okay for us to draw a boundary and say, you're entering a time of contemplating and thinking, and I think you need the freedom to be able to explore that. Why don't we go ahead and break up? Because this whole saving a parking spot while you look for a better parking spot thing, that's not equal. That's not, good faith, us moving together as a couple. And people fear that if they say, let's take a break or let's break up, that they're throwing away 7 good years. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that you can't play that defense anyway. Now, when you bring that up, she may say, no, that's not what I want to do. And then you're like, well, wait a minute, Jim, am I just emotionally manipulating the same way that best friend is doing? Like, am I telling her, pick me or else? I would argue that there's a space for you to do that in an ethical way, where you're saying, I'm choosing to give us some time. Let's take 6 months. We are not together anymore. It's tricky, Jacob, because if they live together or something like that, I mean, we didn't hear that in the email. Things can get a little bit more complicated. But I think Jacob's point is generally right, that if a human's communicating to you that they're not sure what they want to do, it's hard because I don't want you to just sit there on your hands, because I think it's impossible for you to behave normally under that context, and you have no power. And I don't want you to start getting irrational and angry. I kind of want you to have that option to pull back and say, I'm going to give you permission to think this out. And I'm even going to give you the space to do that.
Yeah, I think the healthy thing that comes from doing that is then you take control of your emotions, as opposed to, because that would be torture, to be just hanging there and whatever happens is going to be up to this other person. I have no control over the outcome. I just have to sit here and wait for an answer. That's emotional torture.
And the thing is, like, this type of relationship is supposed to be a nice thing.
Right.
You have relationships in your life that are harder to get out of. You have, family, and you have lifelong relationships with certain people that are difficult to get out of. They're usually not impossible to get out of, but they're much more difficult than a romantic relationship. A romantic relationship, in the grand scale of things, is supposed to be that place that you can go to in your life that is a nice, relaxing, loving thing. And you need to find a way to cultivate that, and it sounds like it's not being cultivated right now.
Yeah, it's supposed to be bringing you joy,
right?
And it doesn't sound like it's bringing you joy. It sounds like it's bringing you.
Yeah, do like what the lady who cleans out the closet says. Exactly. Like, if it doesn't bring you joy, get rid of it.
Yep.
And yes, I am suggesting that you put your girlfriend in a closet.
Hey, we're not minimizing what you're going through, but at the same time, you're allowed to draw a boundary for yourself and guard your own heart, and I don't think that that's irresponsible.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
thanks for writing in.
Yeah, thank you for writing in. Give us an update. Let us know how this goes. I really want to.
Or just tell us if you think we're assholes.
Yeah.
Update us on that too.
Yeah. If you don't write back, I'm going to assume that everything we said was amazing and it worked out beautifully.
Oh, if you don't write back, I'm going to assume that you were just like, oh, those are 3 fucking assholes. I'm done.
See, this is again, this goes back to my optimistic attitude and the way I look at the world. I just assume that everything's going really well.
There you go.
So, all right. Well, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to discuss the Canadian coronavirus. You're listening to Pod Therapy,
This week's THERAPRODUCER sponsor is Kayla Lansbury. Although best known for his country music and his Hollywood role as the Gambler, Nick will remember him best for his starring role in the movie Six Pack. If you know who this person is, comment on our Patreon and let us know. I think I know who it is. If you'd like to join Kayla Lansbury and make the show possible, you can go to www.patreon.com/therapy and sign up. Again, that's patreon.com/therapy.
We're back. You're listening to Pod Therapy. Our next question is about Canadian coronavirus. Before we get into that, you guys, did you see Six Pack? You remember the movie Six Pack?
I saw it.
No clue what you're talking about.
I saw it a long time ago. I mean, I know who it is, but I saw that movie a very long time ago.
Yeah, the last time I saw it, I was probably 9 years old.
Yeah. It's been somewhere that neighborhood.
I remember it.
So I will remember him most for his chain of chicken restaurants.
Oh, yeah, Roasters.
Oh.
Yeah, the Roasters.
Weirdly, that was the
Those
first thing
delicious.
I thought about when Kenny Rogers died. I was like, oh, Kenny Rogers Roasters.
Roasters.
That is literally the only way I even know who he is because of the
really?
Roasters.
Well, that's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
You're a ridiculous human being.
That's it.
Yeah, I can't.
No, the chicken was delicious. Okay, it was life-changing.
I'm just glad that you're keeping.
And that
your
was his
scabies
mark
at
and
home.
his gift on society.
Yeah.
Hey guys, I know many people are getting sick of hearing about it, but that somewhat relates to my question. Living in Canada, we are only now starting to experience the restrictions that the rest of the world has been facing for a week or more. I am inundated from all sides with updates, news, memes, and posts about COVID-19. How serious it is, how serious it isn't, what to do, what not to do, who to trust, who not to trust, who to blame, who not to blame, etc. I have some anxiety issues anyways, but for the most part, I'd been able to ignore most of the hype streaming at me from all directions and keep a level head about it. This morning, I started having a low-lying fear and anxiety. It feels like the beginning of a panic attack, but it never bubbles over and becomes full-blown. People are scared, and I'm starting to feel scared too. This is a scary situation. We've never shut down our borders and businesses like this before. While sitting at my desk, I was hit with an overwhelming urge to break down and cry, just due to the stress of trying to keep up with what's happening in the world. While I know as a 30-something that I am one of the least likely to be badly affected by the virus, even if I should happen to contract it, I worry about loss of work. So far, I'm still working, friends and family getting sick, and on a greater scale, safety within my country, my province, my neighborhood, and where I've always felt confident and safe. I'm doing as advised by doctors, washing my hands, maintaining distance from people at work, and while out, I'm staying home as much as possible. My question is how to deal with this overwhelming stream of information and panic, which could easily cause someone even without pre-existing anxiety a lot of stress. Wishing you and the entire community health and well wishes, your friend and Patreon, Tess, from the Great White Closed North.
Thanks for writing in, Tess. This is a good question. And this is something that we've kind of talked about before on the show outside of the context of the coronavirus, which is the need to seek out positivity when you can, when dealing with depression, when dealing with anxiety, because we had somebody write into the show. I don't know if you remember this, Jim. This is probably in our first season, talking about the stress of just following the news. And we kind of had that discussion about, like at what point, what limits are you going to set on the news, as far as how far you're going to go, are you going to get updates on your phone and what are you going to watch and how often, kind of really setting limits to your own exposure. And I think that's kind of the same thing that we're dealing with here. And one of the pieces of advice that we talked about is that it's really important that you seek out positivity, because positivity doesn't really get the headlines, in the news like, negative events do. And so if you're not actually actively seeking it out, especially at a time like this, I'd feel like you're only getting terrible things. Recently, my girlfriend Laura subscribed to the New York Times, and so with her subscription she got 3 internet subscriptions. So she gets the paper but then also has internet subscriptions, so she gave me one of them. So it's always funny because we're sitting around and our phones will buzz at the same time, and we know it's a New York Times update, a notification that comes through, and it's almost always bad. It's never anything positive. It's always something terrible that has happened. And so I think you have to actually seek out some positive things. One thing that happened actually this week on Twitter, one of our Patreons, THERAPRODUCER, Smitty Scoop, actually sent us a tweet, and he said, maybe we should be kind of talking about what are some great things that are happening as a result of, or not great, but positive things happening as a result of coronavirus. I was like, yeah, actually, So I replied to that. I can't remember what I said. Oh, that I'm taking cleanliness more seriously, as kind of a joke. But there are some things, that if we really want to, we can try to find the silver lining in things, being able to spend some better quality time with family, things like that. But I think you have to search it out. I don't think it's going to just naturally find its way to you.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, to Tess, I just want you to understand one of the first things you're noticing, and this goes out to all the listeners who are dealing with the same thing. You as a human being have limits. You have psychological and emotional limits. And what the writer's talking about is that the writer has pre-existing anxiety, and that this is triggering that, and it's causing a lot of fear and a lot of pain. And the writer's saying, well, even people that don't have pre-existing anxiety, this could really become something that induces it. And it does. And I want to just remind listeners, and if you go back to old episodes, we go through a series of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. We go through a series on PAUSE, P-A-U-S-E. That's a technique that we use to try to help people bring anxiety down and address it. And it's a series of questions that you ask yourself to try to orient yourself to the truth. And what causes anxiety is that there's this primitive sort of caveman brain inside of you. And that brain doesn't know the difference between an actual physical threat that's about to kill you, like a bear, and your thoughts about fear, like social collapse or the what ifs. What if the hospitals are overrun? What if I'm not safe in my neighborhood? What if there's anarchy? What if there's riots and looters and things like that? And whenever we imagine those things, whether we visualize it or just entertain the thought, and whenever we're getting these little blips of bad news from the internet and from news sources that are telling us how bad it is and how fast it's increasing and whatever, it overwhelms sort of our psychological immunity. We have sort of this personal psychological resistance and this immunity level, and our immune system psychologically gets overwhelmed by all that bad data, and that caveman brain is made to feel afraid that you, the human, are in danger. And it's when that happens that you feel anxiety.
To add to that,
and that's when you get overwhelmed.
I mean, just to add to that real quick, Jim, also it's important to point out that your body responds to that as well. Like your body responds to it as though it is a real threat. Like, I have this every once in a while when I think about, like, if I wanted to, I could work myself up into anxiety, and I could actually feel my body have a reaction. Like when I think about, if I were to sit here and think about my dogs running away, like, because my dog, I've got two dogs. I've got a beagle and a dachshund mix, and if they get outside, like outside of an encaged area, my dachshund will listen to what I say. She won't let me pick her up, but she'll listen. But my beagle's gone. I will never see her again. Like, she will take off, and that has happened before, and I've had to chase her down. And just, if I wanted to, if I just sit here and think about that happening, and I've done this before, I don't know how I got into this, but I got to thinking about, like, if someone came to the door and I opened the door and she ran out, what would happen? And my body just started to tense up and react to that. And it's not a real thing that has happened. It's completely manufactured and made up in my brain, but my body will respond to it.
Yes. And that's the key ingredient that I want everybody to understand. Where does anxiety come from? It comes from imagining what could happen, feeling as if there's a threat. The body doesn't know the difference. The caveman brain doesn't know the difference between a real threat and a fictional one that we're imagining. And so we have to go back to that technique called pause. And guys, I'll be honest with you. I do this probably every day now because I do have a history of anxiety. And so I relate to Tess. And as I look at the news, as I go on Twitter, and I commented on this a while ago, Twitter used to be my escape. I'd be living in my reality, seeing my patients, living my day-to-day, and I'd go on Twitter to escape, or I'd go on Reddit to escape and just find what's funny in the world or see what's happening in the news. Now, I need to get to my reality to escape Twitter, because Twitter is so expansive and so full of bad news, and I have to hit pause once a day, P-A-U-S-E. I ask myself, what's the worst thing that could happen? What's the best thing that could happen? What's the most realistic thing that could happen? How am I currently seeing this situation? Am I imagining it in nightmare mode? Is there a more boring way to describe the same thing? A more boring outcome that wouldn't be that scary? Is that possible? U is for understand. If I choose to believe the scary thing, what am I going to do right now? And that answer is usually have a panic attack, or that answer is usually nothing. I won't be helpful. I'm not going to play with my kids. I'm not going to clean the backyard. I'm not going to do something useful. I'm not going to create a podcast that might help people. I'm not going to see the next patient online. I'm going to sit here paralyzed in fear and suffering. If I choose not to believe what, I'm seeing out there in these worst case calamities, what might I do instead? And that is usually get up, live my life, go outside, take a walk, breathe in the air, try to be helpful to humanity if I can be helpful today. S is for suggestion. If I was talking to a friend or a child, what would I tell them? Because we're usually better at giving advice than we are at sizing up our own reality. And we would probably tell another human, hey, humanity has gone through huge, shattering changes before. The rise and fall of empires, the plague, the Great Depression, world wars, nuclear bombs. And you know what? There is a disruption and life gets weird, but it is true that the great story of humanity continues, and usually inside of your own lifetime, things start to bend back to some semblance of routine and pattern and safety and normal, right? And then the last letter is E for evidence, and that's to go carefully through what you're seeing. And it's tricky sometimes, guys, because you'll look at the evidence for coronavirus and you'll say, well, the evidence seems to be that things are getting worse. The evidence seems to be that we're all doomed. The evidence is that Italy's falling apart, that it's spreading into these other nations, that we're closing our borders, that our leaders are doing something about this. But hold on. There's another way to see that same evidence. The evidence you're describing is we are watching this virus now. It is not this silent thing. We're paying attention to it. The evidence is we have more data on it because we're learning about it. The evidence is that we've sequenced its DNA and they are rapidly working on vaccines for it right now. The evidence is that new tests are being developed for it that are supposed to get to the information quicker. The evidence is that your governor, your president, your mayor, they're restricting you as a reaction to this virus. The evidence is that you're not in this alone, that this is a world catastrophe and that world governments are reacting to it. And that's news, but it also is good news because that means something is being done. This is not invisible. It's not just happening to you. The evidence is that there is a global human effort, the best brains everywhere, trying to solve this problem. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to go away right now, but that's part of the evidence too, and that your friends and neighbors are scared too. And we're going to get through this together. And then there's that evidence from history. Humanity and society have gone through mega disruptions, like wars, world wars, where cities are really on fire and there's really scary things. And yeah, there are real dangers, guys. But you have to hold on to that truth that we are going to get through this one day at a time. We're going to do the next right thing, and that's all we can do. And again, limit your appetite, limit your diet of bad news that's constantly flooding in. Get into those online connections that are wholesome and helpful. Again, I referenced that I'm going to try to put out there a support group in the Zoom. Tess, if you're not already a Patreon, jump on for $1 or email us, and we'll make sure that you have that too, because I want you to have that escape and that positive reinforcement. And it's a place where we can talk about our fear, but it's also a place where we can remind each other of the greater human story that's happening. From all across the world, we are going to get through this together.
Yeah, she's a Patreon, so that will be available to her, definitely.
Wonderful.
So, yeah.
And Tess, our hearts are with you. You're going to make it. It's going to be okay.
Yes. The sun will rise again. Maybe not in Canada, but it will, but it's going to be a long time.
Yeah. Depends on how far north you are, Tess. We can't protect you from that.
Canada's still Canada.
The maple syrup is safe.
Yes. Thank God.
Yeah. But hang in there and keep us updated on what you're going through, and join the share group. Join the share group when it comes out and join the conversation. Share what's going on in your area, and let's all encourage each other. And guys, I'm just going to say it to everybody, whether you're part of this Zoom share group that's going to come up on the Patreon, or whether you're just actively using your social media on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, encourage people. It's okay. It's okay to vent. It's okay to hear our fears. It's okay to talk it out, and then help people. Use the skills that you've been picking up through pod therapy over these years. Every once in a while we said something useful. Grab those skills and talk it out. Call people, text them, message them and say, hey, DM me. I'm going to give you my phone number. Call, talk about it, get perspective. When we talk to other humans and we hear other human perspectives, it gets us out of that negative headspace. It's like a cure, and we need that. We've got to bind together right now. It's the only way that we're going to get through this so that we can look forward to the future.
All right. Thanks for writing in, Tess.
Hang in there, Tess. So end of the show. I have no apologies. I've done nothing wrong. But we do want to welcome our newest THERAPAL. Welcome. I'm going to pronounce this as, and Nick, I'll be interested in your interpretation. I see it as Talon. Talon
That's
Daniel.
how I was going to say it.
Do you think
that's
right?
how I was going to say it.
Cool. And also want to welcome our new THERAPOD. Hey, Lindsay Bashara's back. Hey, welcome back, Lindsay. Glad to have you back along with us. And also welcome John DeLong.
And we especially want to thank our bosses, the Elite Eight Mysterious and Shrouded Illuminati members of our fan club, the THERAPRODUCERs. Thank you, Smitty Scoop, Jake Schneider, Robert Brownie Jr., Mint, Kayla Lansbury, David Data Scoop Violon, Judy Schneider, Nathan's Hot Dog Scoop, Dr. Ben Dawn, and ex officio board members Elio Dare and Crazy Manana Scoop.
If you'd like to hear this episode uncut and unedited and enjoy our side projects, which will soon include an online live support group for everybody around the world going through this, come join us at www.patreon.com/therapy. And sincerely, for everybody that's financially supporting our show at this time, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you for supporting mental health. That's all the time that we've got for this week's session. We want to thank our landlords, the Ice Cream Social Podcast, and thanks to those of you who contributed to our show today. We really appreciate it. Remember, pod therapy isn't something you should keep all to yourself. Share this episode with somebody who needs it by opening this episode's description in your podcast app and copying and pasting that link we provided into your social media. Don't forget, you can find us at facebook.com/podtherapy, on Twitter at PodTherapyGuys, and at patreon.com/therapy.
Do you want to submit a question to the show? Ask anonymously at podtherapy.net or email us at podtherapyguys@gmail.com. I'm Nick Tangeman.
I'm still Paulie Mustang.
Thanks, and we'll see you for your appointment next week.
Rest in peace, Paulie Mustang. You were gone too soon.
Yep.
You're a dumb person.